Imagine waking up in your suburban home on a Monday, and by Friday, you're trying to find clean drinking water for your kids in a dense, unfamiliar forest.
Yeah, that's just an unthinkable shift for most of us.
Right. But for millions of people in Myanmar, I mean, this isn't some dystopian novel. It's the actual reality of the last 5 years.
It is, and it's a reality that we often don't see the full scope of.
Exactly. Because when we consume global events, we usually just get these like 10-second flashes of a headline, a ticker at the bottom of the screen.
Right, or a notification you just scroll past.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
And it creates this illusion that conflicts are just momentary events happening far away. But today, okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a primary source that shatters that illusion entirely.
it really does. It's an incredibly powerful read.
It's an impassioned, deeply moving excerpt titled Myanmar, a Nation Seeking Peace and Resilience. And it basically details the stark reality on the ground more than 5 years after the February 1st, 2021 military coup.
And, the value of a primary account like this really cannot be overstated.
Mm-hmm. Because it gets past the statistics.
Exactly. It strips away all that sterile geopolitical jargon we're so used to hearing on the news, and it brings the focus directly onto the human mechanics of survival.
Right. We're not just looking at the broad strokes of a protracted conflict here.
No, we are examining how an entire society functions and really how it fractures under compounding daily pressures. The text meticulously breaks down the structural realities facing ordinary families.
And before we get too deep, it's really important to note for you listening at home, this text takes a very specific, impassioned stance regarding the events following that 2021 military coup.
Yes, it definitely has a clear perspective.
Right. And our goal with this deep dive isn't to take a political side or to endorse these specific viewpoints. We just want to look closely at what this primary source is arguing, right? To understand the reality it describes.
That's exactly right. We're trying to understand how the people on the ground are navigating this immense crisis based on this account.
Because the scale of the displacement outlined here is just staggering. I mean, the text specifically names multiple regions where active fighting is still ongoing.
Yeah, it lists Saging, Chin, Kachin, Karen, Karenni, Magway, and Rakhine.
Right, all of those. We are literally talking about millions of people forced to leave everything behind. Think of it like a massive societal earthquake.
That's a really good analogy.
Thanks.
Hmm.
I mean, the 2021 coup was the epicenter, right?
Hmm.
But the tremors have completely shattered these specific regions, just literally forcing millions into the wilderness,
And to truly grasp that scale, you have to look at the logistics of mass displacement.
which have to be a nightmare.
Absolute nightmare. The source emphasizes that thousands of innocent lives have been lost, obviously, but the geography of that displacement is what makes it so uniquely lethal.
Right, because they aren't going to, like, designated safe zones.
Exactly. These aren't people moving into organized, well-funded refugee camps with infrastructure. The text explicitly states that families are living in forests, in temporary makeshift camps, or pushed right up against the borders.
Just completely exposed to the elements.
Yeah. When you have a geographically widespread shattering of a nation across all those distinct regions, from the mountainous terrain of Chin State to the river valleys of Sagaing, the environment itself becomes a massive variable in survival.
That transition, though, from citizen in a home to a displaced person in a forest, that's something I want to dig into. Because you don't just move a million people into a jungle without catastrophic logistical failures.
Oh, absolutely not. The infrastructure just isn't there.
Right. The text mentions they are out there without enough food, clean water, medicine, or shelter.
Mhm.
And I'm just trying to picture the sheer mechanics of that.
It's almost impossible to visualize if you haven't lived it.
Yeah, like if a community flees into a jungle, the lack of clean water isn't just an inconvenience. It immediately introduces waterborne diseases. The exposure becomes just as dangerous as the conflict they were running from.
Yes, exactly. And the hidden variable here is how deprivation functions as a secondary weapon.
A secondary weapon. Wow, yeah.
The author points out that the violence of the conflict isn't contained to the crossfire. When millions of people transition overnight from living in homes with functioning plumbing to sleeping under tarps, preventable illnesses turn life-threatening very rapidly.
Because they have zero access to healthcare out there.
Right. A minor infection, a bout of dysentery without access to basic antibiotics or clean hydration, the mortality rate skyrockets independently of the active fighting.
That's terrifying. So the text is making a clear argument that the lack of fundamental human needs is creating this parallel crisis.
Yes, one that is just as severe as the kinetic violence itself.
which makes perfect sense when you consider the sheer biological toll of that kind of exposure. But let's look at the people who haven't fled into the forests.
The ones trying to stay in the towns and cities.
Right. The ones trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. The text paints a picture of complete everyday collapse there, too.
Oh, it's a total systemic breakdown.
Yeah. It mentions children are out of school, hospitals are damaged, the economy is suffocating. I like to think of a country's infrastructure like a power grid.
Okay, a power grid. How so?
Well, a physical battle might knock out a few power lines, which is terrible, right?
Mhm.
But what the source describes, the massive spikes in food and fuel prices, the job losses, it's like shutting down the main power plant entirely.
Oh, I see.
You can rebuild a physical line, but if there's no power being generated at the source, the whole grid stays dark permanently.
That power grid analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanism of economic strangulation that the text highlights.
Because it's not just things getting a little pricier at the store.
No, not at all. Inflation in a conflict zone severs the entire supply chain. If the price of fuel quadruples, the local farmer cannot afford to transport rice to the market.
Right, so the food just rots on the farm.
Exactly. Suddenly, the market is empty, local businesses shutter, and families lose their income simultaneously while food becomes scarce.
It's an impossible situation.
It is. The source details how this dual threat of rising costs and disappearing jobs catches ordinary families in a vice. The institutions themselves just cease to function.
And that includes healthcare, obviously.
Yes. When hospitals lack medical supplies due to these severed supply lines, a routine injury becomes a systemic failure.
Wait, I need to push back on this a bit, or at least, play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We usually measure the severity of a conflict by territory lost or the number of physical battles.
Right, the traditional metrics of war.
Yeah. But this text places heavy, explicit emphasis on inflation, job losses, and closed schools. Are we really supposed to understand that this economic strangulation and the loss of education are actually just as devastating to the country's future as the physical violence?
If we connect this to the bigger picture the text lays out, especially regarding the youth fleeing the country, the answer is a resounding yes.
Really, just as devastating.
Yes. The physical violence is the immediate catalyst, obviously. But the economic and educational void dismantles a community's ability to sustain itself into the future.
Right, because without schools, what happens to the kids?
The source notes that children are the biggest victims specifically because their schools are closed. Missing 5 years of education doesn't just delay learning, it creates a structural collapse in human capital.
A structural collapse.
Yeah, you are looking at the creation of a lost generation.
Wow. A lost generation.
When young people look around and see no physical safety and zero economic opportunity, their departure drains the future potential of the nation.
They just have to leave to survive.
Right. That invisible destruction is profoundly devastating because its effects will dictate the country's trajectory for decades after the fighting eventually stops.
That makes total sense. And just as that slow, suffocating collapse to the everyday is happening on the ground, the text brings us right back to the immediate, visceral terror coming from above.
The airstrikes.
Yes, the airstrikes. It details ongoing attacks on civilian spaces. And we aren't just talking about military targets being hit in the crossfire here.
No, the targeting is much broader.
The source specifically points out that villages, homes, schools, and places of worship have been damaged or destroyed.
Yeah, the spaces that are supposed to be safe.
Exactly. I can't even begin to fathom the psychological toll of that. It says communities are living in constant fear, never knowing when the next attack might happen.
That unpredictability is the core mechanism of the psychological terror the author is describing.
It fundamentally breaks the social contract of what a sanctuary is.
It does. When a threat comes from the sky, the concept of a front line completely vanishes. There is no safe zone to retreat to.
You're just totally exposed no matter where you are.
Right. And by highlighting that these strikes are hitting schools and places of worship, the text underscores the erasure of sanctuary. These are the very centers of community life and resilience.
Yeah, the places you go for comfort.
Exactly. When a place of worship is no longer safe, the psychological burden on a community is absolute. It enforces a state of hypervigilance.
Because you can't ever let your guard down.
The terror isn't just the moment of the strike. It's the weeks and months of waiting, constantly scanning the sky, and knowing that nowhere is inherently protected.
Which brings us to the most frustrating paradox in this entire deep dive.
And what's that?
Okay, think about it like trying to bail water out of a sinking boat with a bucket, right? But then someone replaces your bucket with a thimble.
Oh, that's a bleak image.
It is. Because you have airstrikes actively destroying places of worship and schools, creating this immense need. But at the exact same time, the source points out that humanitarian organizations are struggling, and recent reductions in international aid have severely hampered the delivery of food and healthcare.
Yeah, it's a brutal reality.
Wait, but how does that actually happen? If the crisis is demonstrably getting worse, with millions hiding in forests, why on earth is international aid reducing? Are global organizations just losing interest? Or is there a physical mechanism blocking this?
This raises a really important question about global attention spans and logistics. The text forces us to confront this stark reality, the widening gap between escalating local violence and diminishing global resources.
So it's a mix of both, logistics and attention.
Yes. While the source doesn't delve into the specific geopolitical maneuverings, the mechanics of shrinking aid and protracted conflicts usually involve a combination of severe logistical blockades and donor fatigue.
Because it's too dangerous to get the supplies in.
Exactly. Delivering aid in a zone with active airstrikes and shattered infrastructure requires complex, highly expensive logistics. Supply lines are physically severed.
And the donor fatigue part.
Well, as crises drag on past the 5-year mark, global attention spans inevitably shift to newer emergencies, which directly impacts funding.
People just stop donating.
Right. The author is highlighting a terrifying vulnerability here. When top-down international support reduces in the face of escalating violence, it leaves the most marginalized populations completely exposed.
So if the international safety net is being pulled away, and the physical danger from above is a constant, unpredictable threat, how does anyone actually survive?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is where the source makes a really profound pivot. It shifts from a grim geopolitical tragedy to a deeply personal, localized plea.
It does. It focuses heavily on the people themselves.
It tells us that despite these impossible times, the people of Myanmar have shown incredible courage and resilience. It specifically points out that communities are stepping up to help one another.
Yes, the grassroots efforts.
The text highlights volunteers, churches, local organizations, and humanitarian workers who are actively risking their lives to provide care, food, and hope.
And this pivot reveals the mechanics of how survival actually functions when macro systems fail.
What do you mean by macro systems failing?
Well, the text is demonstrating that in the absence of top-down international aid, lateral, community-level support networks must take over entirely. We are talking about radical local resilience.
So neighbors literally saving neighbors.
Exactly. These local organizations and churches operate under the radar. They know the geography, they know the back roads, and they can move supplies through underground networks that large international convoys could never access.
Oh, wow. So a church isn't just a place of worship anymore.
Far from it. In this context, a church becomes a clandestine distribution hub for medicine and food.
That's incredible.
It is. By taking on this risk, these volunteers are actively combating both the physical deprivation and the psychological despair caused by the airstrikes and economic collapse.
And to ground that localized resilience, the text introduces a specific biblical framework. It quotes Romans 12.1
Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn.
Yes, that's the one. And it includes a direct call for prayer for peace, justice, protection, wisdom for leaders, and comfort for the grieving.
It's a very comprehensive plea.
But reading this, it feels like much more than just a religious platitude. It feels like it's asking the listener to actively participate in the emotional reality of the Myanmar people, to not just absorb this as a collection of sad statistics.
That's a great observation. The inclusion of Romans 12.15 serves as a profound structural framework for empathy.
Right, it's an instruction.
Yes, it is demanding that the outside observer engage in active, radical empathy rather than passive sympathy. Mourning with those who mourn is presented as an imperative.
Like you have to do this. You can't just look away.
Exactly. It challenges the global community not to look away simply because the aid budgets have shrunk or the news cycle has moved on to the next global headline.
It really bridges the gap.
It does. The author uses this spiritual grounding to bridge the massive distance between a crisis thousands of miles away and the individual conscience of the reader.
It makes it personal.
Furthermore, it frames the local survival not just as dodging physical threats, but as a deep communal endurance fueled by an unwavering belief that Myanmar will eventually see peace, freedom, and reconciliation.
Hope is not lost. That is a direct quote from the source.
And it carries immense weight after analyzing the sheer logistics of their suffering.
It really does. And I want to bring this right back to you, listening to this right now. We've spent this time dissecting a crisis unfolding on the other side of the world. But engaging with a primary text like this forces you to reflect on the extreme fragility of the everyday systems you rely on.
Absolutely. The things we take for granted.
Yeah. Your local grocery store supply chains, your neighborhood schools, your community clinics, it makes you realize how quickly those invisible pillars can vanish.
But also the strength that emerges when they do.
Exactly. It highlights the absolutely incredible endurance of the human spirit when forced to survive without them through sheer communal willpower.
It demands that we recognize our shared humanity in the face of systemic collapse. The ultimate focus of the text isn't just the tragedy, but the endurance.
The refusal to give up.
Right. It's the refusal of everyday people to let the communal fabric completely tear apart, even when they're displaced into unfamiliar forests and the sky itself has become a source of terror.
Which leaves us with a critical, lingering question for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
And this is something that extends far beyond Myanmar's borders.
Definitely. We talked heavily about the youth earlier, this lost generation fleeing the country because the schools are closed and the economy is strangled.
Yes, millions of young people.
Right. So if millions of young displaced people are continually forced across borders into neighboring nations just to survive, how will this massive permanent shift in human capital permanently reshape the geopolitical and economic landscape of Southeast Asia over the next 20 years?
It's a huge shift. The tremors of this crisis are far from over.
Exactly. The borders of neighboring countries will inevitably feel the weight of that lost generation seeking a future. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep seeking out those multiple perspectives.